talked about schools, but even if you just walk
Very complicated agenda.
Does it actually mean anything at all?
Okay, this is right and wrong, but he doesn't actually follow it.
We've been in recession for a few years now.
Real stories,
We learn from one another.
real issues. Is Islam a threat? And real views. This is Real Talk. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another edition of Real Talk. And welcome to somewhat familiar surroundings as well. We're back here in the exhibition room in Batuftu Mosque in London. Today we're going to be discussing human rights and the role of international law in protecting those rights. Why are there so many human rights abuses across the world? What are the potential risks from that, and what are the potential solutions to these problems? Those are the questions we're going to be having a look at today. Now, to help answer these questions, I'm joined by an expert panel with me here in the studio, which I'll just now introduce. Firstly, I'm joined by Dr. Iftikhar Yasab. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Real Talk. He was the former national president of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Association here in the UK, been honoured with an OBE and has years of experience in international affairs and diplomacy. Yasab, it's a great honour to have you in the programme. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, I'm joined by Amjad Mahmood Khan Saab, who's the National Director of Public Affairs of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the USA. Thanks for coming all the way down.
Thank you.
And last but certainly no means least, I'm joined by Whitney Brown, who is the Senior Director of International Law and Policy at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International. It's a great honour to have you in the programme. Thanks for joining us. So that's our expert panel with us in the studio. And obviously we have our audience here as well. We'll be putting in their points of view throughout the programme. But first of all, we want to get a general overview of the issue of human rights. And our law specialist, Qudsi Rashid, went to Geneva to actually interview Rory McGovern from the OHRC about this topic. So let's take a listen to the word on the street.
Today's programme is about human rights, and you're joining me at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. The United Nations was established in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. The nations of the world came together to vow that the atrocities that were seen during the Second World War would never happen again. In that spirit, the principles of the United Nations were laid down: the maintenance of international peace and security, and the promotion of human rights. The last 60 years have seen great improvements in the field of human rights. Rule of law has come to many countries, the end of colonialisation, and the establishment of justice. However, human rights violations still abound today. Nowhere in the world will you find somewhere where there aren't human rights violations. I'm here at the United Nations to see what can be done about that. I'm joined by Rory McGovern, who is the Chief of the Asia-Pacific region at the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. Good afternoon, Rory.
Hi, good afternoon.
If I could just start by asking you a few questions more generally about what it is that you do, what it is that the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner does. I mean, what is the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner?
Well, it's interesting. Human rights was there at the very beginning of the UN. I mean, one of its first acts was to proclaim the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for a long time, the UN always had an office or a department concerned with human rights. But it was really only in 1993 that a decision was taken to create a high position, a senior official who could really take charge of the human rights dimensions of the UN's work, and beyond that be a moral voice for human rights, a figurehead for human rights, for the human rights movement, which of course encompasses states, but also national institutions, judiciary, academia, civil society, someone that could lead the human rights movement. So really the office was very much created with that vision, and since then we've had 5 High Commissioners. Our current one, Navi Pillay, is a very interesting woman. She was someone who experienced apartheid at first hand, Indian descent, living in Durban, a lawyer who dealt with the affairs of the Indian community in South Africa, became very much involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, was eventually, after apartheid, the first coloured woman appointed to the Supreme Court in South Africa, and then went on to become a judge in some of the international tribunals. So this is the leadership role that the office provides.
I mean, if we can turn to the Human Rights Committee, for example, I mean, it's been, 5 years now that it's been operating, and I think all countries have reported. I mean, in your view, do you think it's made a difference?
Just to clarify, when we talk about the Human Rights Council, we talk about the intergovernmental body made up of the member states that is the principal engine, if you like, of the human rights system. We then have what we call the Human Rights Committee, which is one of several individual committees of experts, actually independent experts, who are looking at the different treaties. And the Human Rights Committee is concerned principally with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's sort of one of the several UN human rights treaties. But the Human Rights Council, yes, it represented a big evolution about 5 years ago now, where its predecessor, the Commission on Human Rights, which had become very polarised and increasingly, difficult sort of environment to have, rational discussions on human rights issues. It was rethought, re-engineered, reformed to become the Human Rights Council. It has a smaller membership, slightly, and some differences in its way of working. One of the interesting differences was that it introduced a new process called the Universal Periodic Review, which is a kind of peer review process by which all countries pass through every 4 years a very similar debate. 3 hours on the basis of a report prepared by the state, a report prepared by the UN, a report prepared by the civil society, and a good sort of 3-hour debate of the issues and what are some of the principal concerns and making some of the recommendations for action. And this is a different kind of approach. It's a more equitable, non-selective, peer-based approach. And so far seems to have produced good results. Of course, like any of these processes, it's open to tactical moves, and you find states that try to orchestrate things so that the right questions are asked, or the best their experience is put in the best possible light. But nevertheless, I think it has represented a really important new accountability device, where every few years states are going to come back and have to answer for some of their conduct, for some of these questions.
Thank you very much. So the UN is the body that's charged with the protection of human rights. It is the international organisation that lies at the centre of the international community's attempt to promote human rights. Yet it is simply one organisation. As we have seen, it has a number of limitations. It cannot fix all the world's problems. So there are still a number of challenges that lie ahead before the founding principle of the United Nations, the promotion of human rights to everyone, wherever they may be in the world, before that objective can really be achieved.
So that was the word on the street, obviously looking at the role of the UN in terms of international law. Whitney, if I could turn to you first, getting the discussion started here in the studio. When we talk about human rights, what do we actually mean?
Well, we're really talking about a very simple idea, which is about the inherent equality of every human being, the inherent dignity and equality. And that dignity and equality is about the right to live free from discrimination, free from fear, for instance, fear from the police, fear from armed groups, and of course, free from want, that everybody should have shelter, food, family, education, healthcare, etc.
Okay. I'm just turning to you. I mean, what's the real importance of this? Why do we need that in today's world?
Well, for all the reasons that Whitney, my esteemed colleague, mentioned, what human rights concerns is really the state of humanity. And so as an individual, perhaps even living in the UK or the US, in a country where perhaps deprivation of human rights isn't as palpable or evident, it's still very much nevertheless important for individuals and citizens to understand and recognize the value of human rights. Right. Because in so doing, you are understanding the state of our humanity and whether we are improving as a humanity to recognize fundamental, universal standards for equality, dignity, and so forth.
Right. Yasser, just turning to you, I mean, something that Amjad just mentioned there is myself living in this country, other people living in so-called Western developed countries. You know, it's human rights abuse is not something we seem to encounter on a day-to-day level. So why is it important for us to be, you know, to care about human rights and put it in as a priority for us?
Actually, I say the most important part of human rights is to be conscious of the rights of others, because it is only by securing and guaranteeing the rights of others that we can secure our own rights. And the issue at the moment is that people have become so much conscious of their own rights, with very little concern or care for the rights of others. And that's where most of the problems lie, because everybody wants to make sure that their rights are secured and they get what they really want. But then there is very little effort that's going on to make sure that the rights of others are also secured. And that is why Islam has very, very strongly emphasized the principle of justice. Okay. Unless there is justice, there can be no guarantee of rights of others. Okay. So it's very important that we try to create societies and reform our societies in such a way that people become conscious of the principle of justice.
Okay, I mean, we'll touch on some of these aspects later on in the program. When you just turn to what is the state of human rights? Are we looking at this generally globally? What kind of situation are we looking at right now?
Well, that's always a difficult question, but I think what we are seeing is, in terms of the problematic aspects, is a lot of intolerance. And we're actually seeing that in Western countries. For instance, in Europe, we've seen a huge upswing in what I would argue is xenophobia and Islamophobia, as well as attacks, for instance, on the Roma. So that's problematic that we have that attitude of rights are for us but not for other people happening in Europe. In developing countries, I think we have incredible poverty and no access to justice. Right. And that poverty is really a symptom of gross inequalities, and that's inequalities within countries, and it's inequality between countries. But you have people living where every day is a struggle for survival and no access to justice.
Amjad, why do we still have human rights abuses today? You know, we're supposed to be a developed society, developing world. Why are we still having these basic issues that we can't seem to really deal with?
Well, I think there is a perennial struggle within society and within interactions between human beings as to, in terms of power, and the power play that exists in the world. And unfortunately, when societies and countries and leaders within those countries are seeking the pursuit of power, they do so at oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes at the expense of human rights. And the abuses persist even in the 21st century, and perhaps even more markedly so, because the world hasn't come to terms with universal standards the way it should. And you know, as my colleague mentioned, these covenants, these universal human rights treaties and standards are really a creature of a product of the 20th century, not too long ago. And so when you have the most important international covenant, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, established in 1948, just 60, 70 years ago, that process needs to take its course. And there has been improvements, but because that is a new phenomenon, the idea of international law and human rights is a relatively new phenomenon. It needs time to actually materialize.
I want to bring in the audience to the discussion now. You as youngsters living up in this country, how does human rights affect you on a day-to-day level? Is something that you're aware of, or something that maybe we don't even think about?
I think it's a very good question to ask. In my personal opinion, human rights is an issue which has always been discussed in news and everywhere else, but with time going, I do respect your view, but I think at the same time, I do believe very strongly that greed has a lot to play with this. So I think the nation's becoming more greedy now.
Or power greed?
Power greed, money greed, so in fact, which is quite important. So I think at both ends, I mean, of course, we do cannot say which particular group is in fact responsible, but I think in the end, it's greed all around, which makes it more worse. But again, I think I will go back to a question from that. For example, I mean, I do know you guys are expert in your area, but I'm totally naive with human rights. My question from that is, in fact, that I know very little about this. So Article 18 in your, which is a Universal Human Rights Declaration. When you see so many things happening around the world, every morning when I put my TV on, I do see everywhere in the world these problems happening. What are we doing, in fact, practically, rather than just the lip service there? Why are the problems still looking much bigger than they were 10 years ago? Any answer?
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I want to get some more points of view and then we'll come back to that question, and thanks for your input. Ali, what about human rights on a day-to-day level? Is it something that you're really aware of? Are we putting enough emphasis on it?
Yeah, I think we are definitely extremely fortunate to have been born and brought up and educated in a society where we have justice, we have human rights. I mean, we often talk about the fact that we as Ahmadis are extremely fortunate that we can practice Islam in this society. But it's a travesty that in order to earn those human rights, it seems that our governments have to sometimes go and abuse the human rights of others elsewhere in the world to protect our way of life. And that's the difficulty.
Yeah.
You know, we are very, very close to the ideal in the way that we have justice and human rights in the Western world, but at what cost is the question
fantastic.
for me.
Okay, Whitney, just turning to you, I mean, something we talked about earlier on there was about greed and economic greed. I wanted to ask you, what role does economics have to play in all of this? Is it that the rich are always, abusing the people who are less well off?
It's a huge issue. I would totally agree that greed is a problem because we have incredible disparities in terms of people's access to resources. So you have some of the poorest people in the world living in some of the most resource-rich countries, and they're often in a conflict in that country as there's a race for resources, and the race for resources is usually supported by governments where the corporations are incorporated. So it's Europe, it's North America. Increasingly, we see China in there also, Australian companies going in and running roughshod over the rights of people in that country as they race to get their hands on those scarce resources to feed the greed and the lifestyle of developed countries where we live way beyond what is necessary for us. So I think that's the first thing. But also we see the failure of the government to actually regulate predatory practices. So when the economic crisis happened, one of the things that we needed to look at was how the government said, banks don't need regulated, the market doesn't need regulation, markets work. Well, if there's one thing that we learned from the economic crisis, it didn't work. There was lying, there was lack of access to information, and there was no attempt to restrain predatory practices, which often targeted women, the poor, minorities in any of these countries, which is about a government's obligation to actually make sure that people are not being exploited. And of course, the consequences are devastating. And one other statistic, of the 6.6 billion people in the world today, the UNDP's Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor estimates that fully 66% have no access to justice. So when they are being exploited, when they're being hurt, they have no recourse, nowhere to turn to say, I need to get my own back.
Okay, maybe Yasser, I can bring you onto that. How can we actually make people care about these issues?
Well, you see, the big issue is that human rights is first generally mentioned in the constitutions of all the countries. Okay. And then you have the Human Rights Charter, which is taken on the fringe. The countries do not focus on the Charter as much as they should. And there is no awareness campaign or education about the Charter itself in the country. So people hardly know anything what the Charter contains. It is very interesting that recently in an international meeting on human rights, I asked one of the new ministers who is responsible for human rights in his country, I asked him if he had seen the Charter itself. Really? And he confessed, he said, no, I'm sorry, I have not seen the Charter myself, but I know about it. Okay. And he said he cares about it, but if he hasn't seen it. And this is the problem. I mean, when we are talking about the third world, Asia and Africa, people have no notion of the Human Rights Charter as it exists. And this is the real issue. that people have to become aware. And when they become aware of it, they will not only respect their own human rights, but the human rights of others as well. Because awareness is very important in relation to respect of a certain charter.
Yeah.
And then the other big issue is that the UN charters are not binding on any country.
Yeah.
If a country fails to comply with them, the UN cannot really do anything mandatorily.
Yes, we're going to come back to that.
Yeah.
But just moving to the audience again, we talked about this UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it'd be interesting how many of you yourselves are aware of that. If we could get just a show of hands, how many of you have maybe read some articles from it? Okay, so one or two people here. Do you think it's something which is widely publicized enough? Is it something that we need to actually, we have some people shaking their heads here as well. I want to get their points of view. We could just pass the microphone back to the gentleman there at the back.
I just wanted to mention that Ayar Saab's point is very poignant in society now, that the developing world do not understand their own rights. Therefore, it's very easy for them to be exploited by a power or somebody from the developed world or something like that. Also, I mean, the issue of the media, I don't know how much that affects people's human rights, so maybe the panel can kind of speak on that a bit more and tell us how the media can skew a person's view or can exploit someone's rights.
Okay, we had another hand up as well, Rizal. I just want to get your input as well.
My question mainly was more to do with education. Some of the points that have recently just been raised about the Charter, it's a lack of awareness. Should this be done at schools? Wendy, should Amnesty, maybe with the input of someone, an organisation like Amnesty International and the UN, should they be doing more to encourage governments to bring this up at an early age so children are aware of human rights and what's actually involved?
Yeah, fantastic question. I mean, let's pose that too. When what kind of work is Amnesty doing at a grassroots level to educate people and raise awareness?
We actually do extensive work on what we call human rights education, both in schools but also for adults, and particularly in developing countries. We have a huge program on human rights education in Africa. The one point I would make, it's not that people don't know their rights. I think we all have a fundamental sense of fairness that says, I shouldn't be scared every time I leave my home, and my children should have education and not go to bed starving. I mean, we all get that. The question is, what's the responsibility of the government to make sure that happens for me? And that comes into the education element, where the education is not about what our rights are, but who's responsible for making sure that those rights are not abused. And that goes to understanding that corporations cannot abuse your rights, your government cannot abuse your rights, majority communities in your country cannot abuse your rights. But understanding that is also about access to justice.
I'm just turning to you. I mean, it's one of those unfortunate aspects. Human rights is supposed to protect the weak individuals, but at the end of the day, it's being caught in all these political traps and nets and systems and processes. And do you think we're ever going to get around that so that we can actually pass through legislation properly and enforce it for the people who actually need these laws the most?
As my colleague mentioned, to be a human rights advocate, you have to be a perennial optimist. And in fact, as a Muslim human rights activist, I am taught, one of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, is that you should always be cheerful, you should always be optimistic and not pessimistic. With that said, I do believe that in spite of all the politicization, in spite of all the difficulties of having people opt into a system that really matters, in spite of all of the struggles, there's been tremendous progress in securing fundamental human rights for millions of people in the world through the UN, through these charters, through these instruments, and through this evolving discourse towards an understanding of universal human rights. It is not going to be solved overnight. All of the struggles that we've endured, that we know about, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States, the rights for women, the idea of torture, all of these very difficult, vexing questions took even more than centuries to resolve. And they're done sort of organically, but it requires that element of progress and instrumental progress and incremental progress. And that, I think the idea of yardsticks and seeing and taking stock of where you've come year to year is very important, and organizations such as Amnesty help with that.
So like you said, you need to be an optimist. Let's finish on a positive note. Whitney, just turning to you, are there any successes that Amnesty have had and other maybe NGOs in terms of human rights? So what have we achieved in the last few years?
Well,
are there any specifics that you could point to?
Amnesty International was actually founded 50 years ago this month. And it was founded by a British barrister who got upset when he saw that 2 people in Portugal had been imprisoned by the government just for toasting freedom. And a journalist, I think for The Guardian, wrote that it was one of the larger lunacies of our time. Well, all I can say is, being a lunatic in this case is very good, because we have freed literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, of prisoners of conscience. We have helped build the architecture around what human rights is. We know that we save individual lives. For instance, we know from many people that we've worked with who've been imprisoned in Iran or in Russia or in China, that when they know that Amnesty International is following their cases, that they're much more careful and much less likely to torture them. Sure. So we do make a difference. We're helping organize in slums in Kenya. We're helping enforce the right to information law in India. You can do a lot, but I think it goes to that idea that we often feel insignificant and powerless in the face of such abuses, but we can make a difference.
Okay, we need to just go for a short break. So thank you for this part of the discussion. Stay with us after this short break. We're going to carry on the discussion and have a look at the role of Islam in this as well. What perspective can we take from this, and why there's so many human rights abuses that are happening in Islamic countries as well. It's a very important issue that I think we need to tackle. So stay with us after this short break.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid.
The Review of Religions is one of the longest-running religious magazines. In print since 1902, it continues to play an important role in presenting the noble teachings of Islam, reflecting its rational, harmonious and inspiring nature. It features articles and viewpoints on different religions, making religion and religious philosophy accessible to a wider readership. The Review of Religions was founded by Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, peace be upon him, who claimed on the basis of divine revelation that he was the promised Messiah and Mahdi, whose advent had been foretold by the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, and by the scriptures of other faiths. The annual subscription of this unique and enlightening magazine is just £15 per year, or $30. To receive your copy of the Review of Religions, visit our website at www.reviewofreligions.org, where you can browse past issues and subscribe online, or contact us by email to info@reviewofreligions.org. The Review of Religions, a unique magazine of religious thought.
I'm here today with the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Mr. Salil Shetty. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. General Secretary. My pleasure. And Mr. General Secretary, in relation to your role, what particular initiatives do you take to help enhance the promotion of human rights?
Well, Amnesty International is the largest human rights people's movement in the world with over 3 million members. So the first the thing we do is to make sure that we have all the evidence and the facts absolutely right. So when there's a violation, we collect the evidence very carefully through very painstaking research, which is corroborated and cross-checked through from many sources. Once we have our facts right, then we start the lobbying with the authorities and also the mass campaigning through our 3 million plus members. We campaign on issues across the world.
Fantastic. And if I may ask just one more question, as this day rounds up for you, I'm sure you're very tired as well. But on a final note, with relation to the youth today, what advice would you have for youth looking to get involved in speaking out against human rights? We have many issues taking place in the Middle East right now. We see that's become quite a popular movement. What advice would you have, and what do Amnesty do in particular to help enhance the involvement of the youth in human rights?
I think the youth have been a complete inspiration in the Middle East and North Africa, where some of the older generation would have thought that, it's impossible to make change happen. The youth have dared to challenge some of the worst dictators in the world. They've used digital media effectively to come together. And youth are a big part of Amnesty's work across the world. In fact, we're going to strengthen our work to support youth movements across the world to stand up and speak truth to power.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much for your time. And we've been here today with the General Secretary of Amnesty International. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to today's issue of Real Talk. We're here, we're discussing human rights abuses globally. And Whitney, if I could just turn to you first. We've been looking at the role of human rights in international law, particularly in the Middle East. It's quite alarming to see that there's so many human rights abuses that are happening in these countries. Obviously, there's been protests as well just recently. What are your views on that, and to what extent are these human rights abuses, and what kind of abuses are happening in these countries? If you could just shed some light on that, please.
Yeah, I think what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, and now what's happening around the region of the Middle East and in the Gulf, is extremely instructive for two reasons. One, people were rising up to say enough because they were tired of political repression, police brutality, torture, and the arbitrariness of abuse that happens. But they also were rising up against the lack of economic opportunity and the rampant corruption. Now, what makes it particularly striking is to realize that these are governments that were largely backed by European governments, the US. I mean, the amount of support for President Mubarak's government in Egypt, where it was absolutely clear that he was willing to run roughshod over the rights of Egyptians, is itself shows that the way that you can have a country that appears to be rights respecting, but saving its own sense of security at the expense of others. The success of the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt are, of course, very fragile. And one question is whether they'll be consolidated. And of course, the absolute crackdown, I mean, Syria, Libya, obviously, are the most troubling, but what we're seeing in Yemen and Bahrain, across the board, Iraq, we're seeing the willingness of governments that are themselves incredibly brutal to shoot their own citizens. Okay. And all those citizens are saying is an end to brutality and give me economic opportunity.
I mean, just moving it a bit more far afield, even Asia-Pacific countries, whether you're talking about Indonesia, Pakistan, and other so-called Muslim countries there as well. What are the issues there? What are the abuses there?
Well, in what you have in Afghanistan and Pakistan, of course, is completely exacerbated by the conflict there and the role of fundamentalist groups that are very intolerant. In Malaysia, in Indonesia, it's interesting. We see we see developments there that are very interesting. You have a very conservative movement in Aceh, but at least the conflict in Aceh that was going before the tsunami has died down. You have religious tensions and communal violence, of course, in India, in the Philippines, in northern Thailand. Southern Thailand, one part of Thailand. Okay. And that communal violence based on religious difference is extremely disturbing. Okay. And I think one of the things, the importance of religion, of tolerance for different religious views, and acceptance that people have the right to choose their own religion, as long as their exercise of that religion doesn't impinge on the rights of other people, is so critical.
Yeah, Yasab, just turning to you. I mean, we're looking at these Muslim countries, and unfortunately we have oppression and persecution. What are the reasons for this? Is this because of Islam, or is it more subtle problems within the country?
I think it's because of ignoring the beautiful teaching Islam has offered on rights. Islam takes the view that the fundamental principle is the principle of rights for all. Okay. And that is rights for all the creation of God. Islam does not leave out the rights of anything that God has created. And this is a beautiful teaching because it then gives us a sense of responsibility towards maintaining and sustaining the rights of environment, the rights of animals, and the rights of humans as well. And all these rights are then associated with our obligations and rights to God Himself. So it's a very comprehensive view that Islam has provided for the sanctity of rights.
Right.
And then Islam has provided principles on which these rights are based. For example, the Holy Quran tells us that be very careful about measure. Be very careful about measure, you know, and be very careful about balance.
Right.
So balance and measure in everything is extremely important.
Right.
Because even in the case of human rights, balance is very important. And that brings in the element of equality, and that also brings in the element of justice, and treating everybody in the same way, and as everybody should be treated.
Okay,
and
I just need to bring in the audience. We'll come
Sorry,
back.
there's just one little point that I wanted to mention before I finish. And Islam's base of human rights is related to the needs of people. This is something very important that I wanted to emphasize. Somebody may have more needs, somebody may have less needs.
Okay.
So you try to fulfill the needs of every human being as it is required in a very dignified and respectable manner.
Okay, all right, now that's a very important point. We have some hands up in the audience. Yes, if I could just get the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. Just a point that Whitney mentioned a few moments back about the religion playing a role in Pakistan, Indonesia, and the companies of that sort. In my personal, very humble opinion, I think it's important to understand the teachings of religions first. For example, Christianity teaches love thy neighbor. And then Islam teaches, for example, Mr. Ayaz also mentioned very eloquently that in fact Islam talks clearly about people's rights. It's very surprising to know that Islam talks about all the creatures as is mentioned, not just the humans. At the same time, women's rights, then rights of people who are non-Muslims in Islamic states, and the rights of even dead. The amazing thing I was reading Quran recently was in fact not just teaching about who are living, but even also a hadith, the saying of Holy Prophet in Bukhari, that in fact if somebody is dead and you're in a combat against a nation, and you must respect the dead bodies.
Yeah, it's even the sanctity
of dead bodies. And also don't cut trees. If somebody's sitting in any of the worship places like synagogue or church, do not attack them. Yeah. If somebody is not having any arms in his hands, leave them alone.
No, that's a very
Woman,
good point.
child.
I mean, like you said, there's so many aspects in Islam regarding rights. I want to get some.
So we should, we should educate Islamic nations first. That Islam teaches this, and you must treat your civilians.
I want to get some other people to put in their points of view. What about just the gentleman just there on the end?
Whitney, you were talking earlier about the uprising in the Middle East, and earlier on we were talking about the enforcement of human rights, and to some extent they're only useful to the extent that they are enforced. And so, especially with regards to Libya and Egypt and those kind of countries at the moment, we see potential war crimes being committed. And obviously the International Criminal Court was set up to try and solve this sort of thing, but Luis Moreno Ocampo, who is the current prosecutor, I mean, there's a stat that he hasn't completed a single prosecution in his whole time. So, I mean, the question is, to what extent are courts like the ICC useful if, even after so many years, they're not prosecuting people for war crimes which are obviously being committed in these countries?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Whitney, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, on the International Criminal Court, the first thing to know is it was always expected that it would hear very, very few cases. But you're right, it's been off to an incredibly slow start. It did get a referral from the UN Security Council on Libya, and my understanding is indictments or arrest warrants are going to be issued sometime in the near future. But as we know from the case of Sudan, President al-Bashir of Sudan has had an arrest warrant against him for over a year, and basically no country's been willing to arrest him. But I think the key point is that we're using the International Criminal Court to try to build up the domestic court systems of all countries so that they can investigate any crime under international law, including war crimes.
Okay, I just want to bring you into the discussion. Obviously, in this part of the program, we're looking at Islam's role in all this. What are the actual Islamic teachings on human rights, and what kind of specifics can we look at to say that, you know, this is what Islam upholds?
Well, Mr. Ayaz covered it very well. I would just add a few points. You know, there are three sources of guidance in Islam. So every Muslim follows these three sources: the Quran, the Sunnah, the example of the founder of Islam, the Holy Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, and his sayings. So you always begin with the Quranic principles, and Mr. Ayaz very beautifully summarized them. There's a few points to also bear in mind: the idea of adl, justice, and the idea of amanat, trust. These are two pillars of governance in Islam. Right. So with respect to human rights, theoretically at least, every Islamic nation should govern with those two very important principles in mind. And it's not just adl, the idea of justice, it's the idea of absolute justice, that justice is meted out fairly and it's universally applied, that there's no exception to that, and that all individuals, regardless of their race, religion, creed, nationality, gender, are all entitled to that sense of justice. Okay. And with respect to the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet is extremely important. That in as much as a lot of Muslims understand the Quranic principles that govern human rights, very few Muslims, sadly, understand the example of the Prophet. Okay. For example, he did not just speak about these Quranic principles of human rights and justice. He actually practically manifested them in his own example by actually writing the first constitution of a nation state, right, famously known as the Charter of Medina, a pact that governed 10,000 citizens at the time, 40% of which were Jews, another 40% were non-Muslim Arabs. Only 10 to 20% of the individuals that were governed by this charter were actually Muslims. Right. That is, were representing his own faith. And there were 46 clauses in this charter, sure, several of which have very robust and explicit protections for the Jews and non-Muslim Arabs. I'll give you another example, which I think is very important in the light of Egypt. And that is, he wrote a series of letters to individuals who were non-Muslim in the Arab Peninsula, in and around the area. One such letter was written to the monks of the St. Catherine Monastery in Mount Sinai. Now, this was a letter that explicitly granted protections to the Christian monks in Mount Sinai and to all Christian communities, to such an extent that he explicitly said that no harm is to be made on their churches. Now, fast forward today to the abuse of Egyptian Coptic Christians. Just recently, several of their churches were burned down. Right. How paradoxical and ironic that just a few hundred miles from where this monastery, the oldest one in the world, sits, and where this letter is prominently displayed, and the monks of the St. Catherine Monastery cherish this letter, they are burning down churches.
That's a really good point. So turning to the audience, as a group of Muslims, are we courageous enough to take up this fight and, you know, actually put human rights forward as a priority for these governments? As we mentioned, in this country, we have the freedom of speech, we have the freedom of expression, where we can actually go out there and try and make a difference. Do you think we're doing enough? What kind of things should we be doing on an individual level as well? Yeah, I've got some hands up. Just the gentleman just at the back there, please.
Yeah, I think that is vitally important to be educated on these subjects. But one thing that we need to be educated on is that what our responsibility is towards the government and what their responsibility is towards us. It's fine if we're educated, but expressing ourselves shouldn't be in a violent way, in an uprising. Mm-hmm. That only creates more kind of social disorder than creating peace or harmony. So we should do it in a dignified way, after being educated about the topics and what our rights are.
Valid point. Yeah, there's one or two hands raised.
Yeah, I just want to bring the United Kingdom into it. I think we are still struggling with overseas governments. You know, we give hundreds of millions of pounds of aid to Pakistan, for example, and only 1.5% of that actually filters down through to the education level. And, you know, following on, you've had major disasters in Pakistan, you've had this massive earthquake, you've had floods. How much of that money actually goes, you know, into, why do we not see any restructuring.
So are you saying instead of just chucking money at it, we should be looking at actually structuring it a bit better to help develop?
There's no accountability. I mean, perhaps we do our bit to, give.
Yeah.
But why is there no accountability?
Okay. Yeah. All right. Valid point. Yeah. Just Riz there. Yeah.
I think one very important thing, and this is more towards Wendy, is that it's very easy for us to sit in the West and take a dismissive view and to say there isn't anything we can do about this. This is happening far away. There are things we can do about it, and Amnesty International, it does show a positive way. It's a peaceful method of gathering evidence, making yourself aware first of all before you're going to challenge anything. And I think that's the general thing, because intolerance stems from ignorance.
Right.
And if we choose to remain ignorant about other people and other people's rights, as the Al-Sab mentioned, we will fall into the same trap as well. Not knowing how to protest, not knowing how to put forward rights, and not knowing how to challenge government.
Okay, there's another point here. I just want to try and get as much input from the audience as we can.
I think another issue when it comes to educating is there's a perception of hypocrisy from the West when it comes to a lot of human rights. For example, the regulator for human rights, you say, the UN, whereas a lot of the Western powers have the power of veto. I mean, I think that's a major obstacle to implementing human rights across the world, as well as our own human rights abuses. For example, Guantanamo Bay, and using legal procedures to get around fulfilling our own obligations for human rights.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good one, especially looking at the current day situation, whether it's the so-called war on terror and the rights abuses within the US Army, the UK Army as well. People are saying that on one hand, the UK and the US is saying that everyone should work towards these human rights standards, but at the same time, maybe they're not really following them. We've still got Guantanamo Bay. There's, from my understanding, there's still at least around 150 people who are still there. I don't know, maybe you can tell me otherwise, but we have these abuses, there's extradition, and so there's so many offences which are still happening. And it seems that there's almost this double standards. Whitney, what would you like to comment on that? Where do we still have to progress in terms of that?
Yeah, I think the hypocrisy of governments that claim to champion human rights is one of the most destructive things you can do to human rights. And obviously, the response of the US government and others in the wake of the attacks on September 11th were absolutely hypocritical. Guantanamo Bay is the most glaring example of the willingness of the US government to say to its non-Muslim citizens, we will keep you safe, and we're willing to absolutely shred the rights of anyone outside. So it created an otherness. And human rights is fundamentally about seeing us as human beings first, with differences, of course, but not as other. And that's what leads to the racial profiling. It's what leads to just sort of the abuses, because what the U.S. did is said, these are the worst of the people in Guantanamo Bay, the men in Guantanamo Bay. And they never let you see them. They never let you see that they were human beings with families. They never, of course, proved their case. And it's just one of the most egregious cases of human rights abuses. And it's being replicated and exploited by others. But the U.S. definitely lost its legitimacy on that one.
Okay, all right, fantastic. Turning to my panel, just let's get some concluding remarks. Al-Sab, very briefly, just from you, what is the role of Islam in the future, looking towards the next few years of this world? What role does Islam have in terms of human rights?
Well, basically, Islam wants to make absolutely sure that we have societies where there is peace, where there is harmony, where there is justice, where there is care, and the welfare and well-being of every human being is looked after without any discrimination in whatever part of the world. So this is a very important challenge for us as Ahmadiyya Muslims, that we have to make sure that we try to create that universal society which believes in a universal faith and in a universal law that God has provided and God himself. That is how we can create this revolution which we are looking forward to.
All right, and just very briefly, what's your view of the whole discussion that we've had today? How important is it for our viewers at home to think about these issues and actually maybe put some of these advice into practice?
It's absolutely critical. In today's environment, the issues of human rights are actually on the minds of more people than perhaps a decade ago. And that's perhaps owing to world events. One of the audience members spoke, for example, about the recent killing of Osama bin Laden. The world watched that happen. So the question is, There should be no inconsistency, as other panelists mentioned, between one's actions and one's words abroad. There's should be no notion of exceptionalism, for example, American exceptionalism on issues of torture and other issues. And I think the hope is that when the international community comes together and actually calls out the hypocrisy and rises above the differences that divide and actually focus on the similarities that unite, we can elevate the world discussion above this situation. In as much as Osama bin Laden's capture may have been, or killing may have been problematic from a legal perspective, I think everyone, or most of the world, if not the whole world, agreed that there was a scourge of extremism that had to be dealt with, and he was a figurehead that the world is better without. But the question for me, as a Muslim advocate, is when will Islam turn to its true and essential teachings? When will that revitalization take place within the 47 Muslim countries in the world? With all the regime changes in the Middle East, the question remains, will the new individuals who have all the qualities of true democratic movement, will they institute real reform? So for example, in Egypt, will there be true constitutional reforms? It's a golden opportunity. Will that constitution actually protect the rights of religious minorities?
Those things, I mean, we'll have to wait and see what happens in these countries, and obviously everyone hopes for the best. When you're just turning to you, looking to the future, what work can Amnesty International do, and where are you sort of hoping to see yourself? You've just had your 50th birthday. Maybe in the next 50 years, what would you like to achieve by then?
Well, I think first of all is never to, again, let any human rights abuse go unwitnessed, to always call it out and expose it. And this goes not just to governments that abuse, but it also goes to other entities, whether it's corporations, armed groups, other non-state actors, that we will always be a witness. The second thing is really to give a voice, to give a platform for those whose voices are never heard. There's so many people who they experience horrific abuses and their voices are utterly silenced. The third, absolutely challenge hypocrisy. If there's anything that human rights is most fundamentally about, it's about there's no different treatment, there's no justification for discrimination or exclusion or differential treatment. So if there's justice in the East, North, West, and South has to be the same. We can't have double standards. And finally, it is that we can all make a difference. I mean, one of our former prisoners of conscience, Eleanor Sirleaf Johnson, is the first woman president of African country. So she went from being tortured in a prison to being a head of state in Africa. That's because individuals collected together and said, we're going to make a difference. So join us.
All right, thank you. Amjad Khan, Dr. Fakhari Yasab, and Whitney Brown, thank you very much for joining us in this program. Thank you to the audience here as well, and the viewers watching at home, and I'm sure you've got your views on this topic as well. So don't forget, you can always get in touch with us and our team. Our email address is realtalk@mta.tv. You can also visit our official website, www.mta.tv/realtalk, where you can find out more information about these topics, have a look at previous episodes as well, and put forward your comments on your points of view as well. And also you can follow us for the latest news on our Twitter account at @MTA_realtalk. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this particular discussion, but thanks for watching. And like we said, at the end of the day, it's down to us to instigate this change, and let's hope that we can actually make some sort of change on a grassroots level. Hope you can join us next time for another edition of Real Talk, but until then, Assalamu alaikum.